Yeah, it's just been, 2-3 weeks since that horrible shooting in Las Vegas where the gunman opened fire on this horde of helpless concert goers. How horrid. And if that was the only time it ever happened, maybe we'd write it off, but then we remember Littleton, Colorado, and Virginia Tech University, and the Boston Marathon. And over again, we hear these stories, and we just say, this world is filled with evil. How do we live in a world like that? How do we make it? Of course, those are the big stories. What's perhaps as tragic or maybe even more tragic is how close to home it often hits. As we hear about murders, assaults, robberies, burglaries, shootings in our own cities, in our own neighborhoods, maybe even impacting our own families. This world's a tough place. Amen? Amen. And of course, then there's the quote-unquote more normal stuff, the challenges of the various phases of life as they hit us, the realities of sickness, things like economic uncertainty, etc., etc., etc. This world is tough. Does God have some things to say to us? Yes, he does. And with those kind of thought starters in our mind, let's now turn our attention to what the God of all grace has to say to us in Psalm 23. It's printed in the bottom of page 6 of your service folder, or you can watch it on the screen, whichever you prefer. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's beautiful, isn't it? If it's not the favorite segment of the Bible, it's got to be in the top 10, maybe even the top 3. And it makes sense. Very quickly we figure out, no, this isn't just talking about some random shepherd and random sheep. Rather, this is a picture of God, the shepherd, and us, the sheep. And the pictures are glorious. That the shepherd is going to lead us sheep into green pastures and to quiet waters where we can slack our thirst. That God is going to be with us through thick and through thin. That he'll never leave us or forsake us, even in the valley of the shadow of death. And that eventually God will take us sheep and he'll take us to his heavenly kingdom that we might be with him for all of eternity. And it's awesome. But there's also probably a whole lot here that we who are non-sheep herders probably don't see. I'm just curious, show of hands, how many of you raised sheep any time in your life? Yeah, that's a big 0. Huh? So the guess is that we're probably missing some things in here. So one of the things I did this past week was I reread a book which was written by a guy who now is his doctorate in something, but he spent a good chunk of his time raising sheep. And one of the things that comes to mind pretty quickly when you hear this shepherd talk his way through this Good Shepherd psalm is that when God is referring to us as sheep, It is not a compliment. Here's some of the stories that he told about the sheep. One of the things he pointed out is that sheep are extremely skittish. He said he has seen it happen where a rabbit will bounce out from behind a bush and the herd will stampede. He told one story about one time when some friends came to visit him. He was out in the fields with the sheep, and they were able to drive up to where he was, and they came hopping out of the car, and there was a little child with them, and they had just bought a little puppy for the little child, and the little puppy jumped out of the car, and the sheep stampeded at the sight of this little puppy. Skittish. He told stories about how sheep are territorial and selfish. He said if he wasn't close to the sheep, it was very typical for some of the older ewes, that's EWE, some of the older female sheep, to decide they wanted a particular piece of grazing land or a particular spot where they could rest, and it didn't matter if there was some other sheep who was there, they wanted it. And so he said they would kind of arch their neck and lower their head, and boom, they would headbutt that other sheep until they had moved it along, even though the pasture was grand and glorious and there was all sorts of places to lay. They wanted that spot because they were territorial and selfish. Told stories about how sheep are rebellious and love to wander. He said there was one sheep, and he described her as just this beautiful sheep. I still don't have really quite a clue what makes a sheep beautiful, but apparently shepherds know what makes sheep beautiful. And there was this one beautiful sheep, but she had this horrible tendency that she would wander the fence lines. And she would always be looking for a place where she could push her way through the fence line to get into other pasture, which was usually inferior. This guy's ranch bordered the sea, and so his fences went down to the sea. But when it was really low tide, his fence line sometimes didn't go out as far as it needed to. This sheep, sure as all get out, would go down to that spot and get out of the pasture and get out of the field, putting herself in great danger. And if that wasn't bad enough, she would lead her lambs to do the same thing. And sometimes other sheep as well, putting not only her, but her lambs and other sheep in danger of getting nicked off by predators or whatever. Eventually the shepherd said he had to take out his knife and he had to butcher that sheep for the safety of the rest of the flock, because that sheep was so rebellious, so loved to wander. Rebellious, wandering, selfish, territorial, skittish. Does that describe anyone that you know? Yep. That's us, isn't it? Selfish. Oh my goodness, how often doesn't my life revolve around me, myself, and I? And I don't even know what my loved ones around me are wanting or needing. Territorial. That's my fill in the blank. Rebellious? How often haven't I listened to what God has said, and I've gone out and done exactly the opposite of what he has said? Skittish? Oh, how we fret and how we worry. And so often we fret and we worry about stuff that never even happens. What a bunch of sorry sheep we are, huh? And how right it would be for God, just like that shepherd had to take and butcher up that sheep, how right it would be for God to pour out his anger and judgment upon us. And And so it's with remarkable joy that we reread the first line in the psalm. What does it say? The Lord is my shepherd. And perhaps a just little bit slightly more accurate translation of the Hebrew there would be, the Lord shepherds me. Can you imagine? Why would God want to have anything to do with me? As rebellious, stubborn, selfish as I am, why would God want to have anything to do with me? And in a remarkable grace, he says, I'm going to shepherd you. I'm going to guide and direct you. What mercy, what grace. And oh, by the way, as you're looking in your service folder, how's that word Lord spelled? Did you catch it? Yeah, it's that all capital letter thing. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The reminder that we have a God who is absolutely faithful to his promises. That word tells us, the NIV helps us because as it translates us, it clues us in that that's one of God's special Old Testament names which emphasizes his faithfulness to his promises. That when God makes a promise, he will never, ever break it, ever. So who is shepherding you? The faithful God. The God who is so faithful to you that he was willing to lay down his life for his sheep. You stop and you think about that. That's nuts. What shepherd in his right mind would lay down his life for recalcitrant, rebellious sheep? This one would. And this one did. The Good Shepherd laid down his life because he wanted you and me to be forgiven, to have a home in heaven, to be able to enjoy fellowship with our shepherd for all of eternity. The shepherd in the story, the book I read, talked about his own faithfulness and how hard it was. He said he often had to sleep out in the fields with his sheep, particularly if it was lambing time when the ewes were giving birth. He would often have to sleep out in the fields with his sheep, his rifle at his side, so that he could at a moment's notice jump up and shoot wild dogs, predators, etc. He had to be faithful. The sheep needed it. The Lord, your faithful God, he is your shepherd. And that helps us, doesn't it? That helps us to make it through this life which is so hard, so difficult, knowing that we have the Lord, the faithful God at our side, and he is shepherding me. That helps. But there's something even more and perhaps even better. And understand that we have to understand a little bit about how Hebrew poetry works. In fact, Hebrew literature in general tends to work this way. But Hebrew poetry particularly is often like a hill. You start at the bottom of the hill, you work your way up to the top of the hill, and then you work your way back down the other side of the hill. In other words, that in Hebrew poetry, almost always the high point is right in the middle. And I know what you're thinking right now. What's the middle of this psalm? Well, the middle of this psalm is the expression, for you are with me. In the Hebrew, there's 26 words before, 26 words after. Right smack dab in the middle, for you are with me. And with all the pictures of the green pastures and the quiet waters and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the high point of the psalm is for you are with me. The shepherd talked about it. He said it was absolutely amazing how the presence of the shepherd there with the sheep completely changed things amongst the sheepfold. If the shepherd was there, the sheep were much less likely to headbutt with each other and be territorial and selfish. If the shepherd was there, the sheep were much less likely to wander. If the shepherd was there, the sheep were much more likely to graze contentedly and then to lie down in peace and safety because the shepherd was there. Who goes with you into the world? Jesus does. When you're young and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do next, and do you apply to this high school or that? Do you apply to this college or that one? What kind of a major do you take? Who's going along with you for the ride? Jesus is. As you move along into life and you start to make some of those big life decisions, do I take up this career or that career? Should I change jobs or should I stick with it? Should I try to get the promotion or should I not try to get the promotion? Should I try to buy this house or not? Should we move to this part of the country or that part of the country? Who's with you? Jesus is. As you move along into that midpoint of life where all of a sudden spectacles become necessary and the gray hair tends to show up on your head and you realize you can't jump as high as you used to, and when you come down it kind of hurts a little more. Who goes with you? Jesus goes with you. Most importantly, when you take that walk through the valley of the shadow of death and realize, really, every step of our life, we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death from the moment we're conceived. But there does come a point where we're nearing the end of it. When our eyes flutter shut for the last time, who's going to be with you? Jesus is. You are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Jesus is there. So is it possible that our world could see another horrible shooting like what happened out in Las Vegas a couple weeks ago? History would seem to indicate that not only could it happen, but it likely will, because we've seen so many of them. Is it even possible that you and I could be involved in something as horrible as that we could be victims? Absolutely. God's never promised that our life would be easy. But who will be there? Jesus. Jesus will be there every step of the journey, no matter what. He'll be there with his forgiveness, with his power, with his goodness, with his love. And he will keep on shepherding you home. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Why? Because Jesus is there. Not because it's necessarily going to be easy or always happy, but because Jesus is there. And someday I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever with Jesus. Amen? Amen. Amen.